The north is cold and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. He had read it 3 times. The scroll lay open across the great carved map, across the carved stone of Westeros, stretched from the Stormlands to the northern mountains, its edges curled like something that did not want to be read. The red wax seal had gone brown with 16 years of dark storage, cracked at one corner where the courier who found it had been careless. Around it, 2 other documents, a page torn from a registry book, High Septon Maynard's handwriting in cramped ecclesiastical script, each letter formed with the exacting care of a man who understood that what he was recording would outlast him. And beside it, a second letter, smaller, the paper thinner, the handwriting of a girl who had been frightened. Not the round, careful loops of formal correspondence, the letters of someone who did not expect to finish writing. Stannis Baratheon stood at the window. Dragonstone did not have mornings. Exactly. It had a lightening of the gray, the sky going from charcoal to pewter to the washed-out silver that passed for day on this rock. The wind never stopped. It came through the tower walls in ways that defied the architecture. Salt and cold stone pressing at the edges of the room, finding the gap at the window shutter, breathing through it with a sound like a man deciding whether to speak. The fire in the grate had burned down to red teeth. He had not fed it. The cold in the room had been building for 2 hours, and he had not moved to stop it. He had been standing here since the 2nd hour of the night. He turned back to the table, picked up the smaller letter, read it for the 4th time, though he knew it by memory now. Every word, every trembling loop of ink, the places where the pen had pressed harder and left a ghost of itself in the parchment. He must not know. Not until the realm is ready, not until he is ready. The ink had bled at one edge where something wet had fallen on it once. Rain, perhaps, or not rain. He set it down. His leather glove dragged across the carved stone of the painted table, a small, dry sound in the silence of the chamber. He looked at his hand on the map, at King's Landing, carved and painted at the mouth of the Blackwater. Joffrey was there. Cersei was there. Ned Stark was in the black cells and would be dead within a month if nothing changed. And at the very top of the table, at the northernmost edge of the known world, where the stone carver had drawn a thin straight line across the continent and labeled it in letters barely large enough to read, the wall. Stannis studied it for a long time. The door opened without a knock. Only one man at Dragonstone entered without knocking. Stannis did not turn. Davos Seaworth crossed the room with the careful step of a man who had learned to read floors in the dark. He was dressed but not armored. The middle of the night had found him, too. He stopped at the table, looked at the documents spread across the carved stone face of the realm. His eyes moved to the seal first, then the registry page, then the small letter. Stannis slid the registry page toward him without speaking. Davos read. He read slowly. He had taught himself letters with considerable effort, and he honored the skill by not rushing it. His lips did not move. His face did not change at first, and then it did, the way a loyal man's face changes when the ground shifts without warning. A slight tightening around the eyes, a stillness settling over his expression that was not calm. His right hand found his left, found the onion signet ring on his smallest finger and closed around it without his seeming to know he was doing it. "This is Maynard's seal," Davos said. "Yes, you're certain it hasn't been—" "I looked for forgery," Stannis said. "Maynard's seal matches 3 documents in the archive. 2 I pulled from the vault myself. The wax composition, the signet impression, the ecclesiastical hand. I compared them line by line against 11 other registry entries from his tenure. I spent 4 hours looking for a reason to doubt this document." A pause. I found none. Davos was quiet. His thumb moved around the ring in small, slow circles. "The girl's letter," he said. "Lyanna Stark's handwriting, confirmed against Ned Stark's letter to the Royal Archive, written after the Tower of Joy. The letter requesting Dawn be returned to House Dane." Stannis moved to the table, stood over the 2 documents side by side. The arch of the N, the drop of the Y below the baseline. They are the same hand, a child's hand, trained by the same maester. "Which would explain the similarities," Davos said, carefully, not as an argument. As a man pressing against stone to find out if it will hold. "The shared formations are expected. The ones that matter are in the pressure points, where the grip tightens under fear or grief." The girl was terrified when she wrote this. Ned Stark was shaken when he wrote his letter after the Trident, when Robert was still threatening to burn the city. Under duress, both hands do the same thing. He straightened. Same maester, same fear response, same person behind the pen. Silence. The wind found the shutter gap and pressed through it. Salt. Cold stone, the ghost of everything the sea had touched on its way here. It's authentic, Davos said. The words came out flat. A man who has stopped hoping for a different answer. Yes. Davos looked at the two documents for a long moment. He looked at the scroll, at the old brown seal, at the thin parchment of a dying girl's letter. Then he looked at Stannis. At the set of his jaw, the quality of stillness in him that was not peace but its opposite. Something held under enormous and invisible pressure, and he said very quietly, "You could burn them." The room did not change. The fire did not stir. The wind continued its work at the shutter. Everything held exactly where it was. Stannis turned from the window. In the gray pre-dawn light, his eyes were the coldest thing in the room. Not angry, not grieving. The eyes of a man who had arrived at the far side of a reckoning that had taken all night and found the same answer waiting for him there as had been waiting at the beginning. "No," he said. "I could not." Davos held his gaze. He had served this man for years. He had run the siege lines into Storm's End with fish and salt onions in the hold while men inside ate boots and rats and worse. He had watched Stannis refuse every mercy, every shortcut, every comfortable untruth the world offered him, and accept every consequence of that refusal without complaint or theater. He had sometimes despised him for it. He had never once been uncertain about what kind of man he was standing beside. "Your claim to the throne," Davos said, "is void, flat, final, the way Stannis said everything that was finished. The moment Rhaegar's legitimate son can be identified and proven, my claim is void. Robert built his throne on a war waged against a man who had committed no crime, against a marriage the faith had sanctioned and the groom had not survived to announce. The child of that marriage is the rightful heir under every precedent the Great Council established." He returned to the table, looked at the wall, the thin carved line at the top of the world. He is currently at Castle Black, preparing to say his vows. Davos followed his eyes to the stone north. "You're sailing to him, yes, not King's Landing. King's Landing will still be there. The boy at Castle Black is about to swear himself to the Night's Watch and surrender his name, his claim, and any future that belongs to him. That cannot be undone." He picked up the scroll, rolled it with the careful steadiness of a man handling something he intended to carry a very long way, tucked it inside his cloak, against his chest, between the leather and the wool, where it settled with a dry rustle against his ribs. "Every problem compounds from this moment forward. None of them compound in my favor if those words are spoken." From outside the tower, down the cliff face across the harbor, the Baratheon war drums began. Low, rhythmic, carrying across the flat gray water, the fleet captains being summoned before sunrise, 30 ships finding their purpose in the dark. Davos stood in the drum sound and the cold, his hand still on the ring, and said nothing. Stannis looked at the painted table one last time, at the wall, at the thin line between the world men knew and whatever waited behind it in the dark. "There is a Lannister bastard on the throne," he said. "There is a true king living as a sworn brother of the Night's Watch. I intend to correct both problems simultaneously." The drums rolled on across the water. The fleet was waking. The fleet left Dragonstone before full light. 30 war galleys in double column pulling out through the sea gate with the mechanical precision of men who had drilled this departure until it lived in their muscles. The Baratheon drums set the stroke rate from the command ship, each beat carrying across the dark harbor water, chest deep and certain, the sound of a fleet that had trained in proper storms. The oars rose and fell together, the pennants cracked in the offshore wind. On the rocks above the gate, the castle's gargoyles watched without opinion as the last galley cleared the channel and turned its prow northeast into open water. Stannis stood at the bow of the lead galley and watched Dragonstone diminish behind him. He said nothing to the men who watched him watching it. He had told no one their destination. He had issued sailing orders by heading and landmark, not by name, north-northeast from Dragonstone. The Sisters to port, White Harbor's outer bay to starboard and well clear. Continue north. Questions about the final port were met with the same silence he applied to all questions he had decided were not worth the breath of an answer. His captains were paid to sail where he ordered. They sailed. The narrow sea was familiar water. The fleet moved through it with the ease of something doing what it was built for. The swell medium and rolling, the spray salt and cold, the sky overcast but manageable. Storm veterans, these men. They had sailed the black water in weather that scattered other navies, had held formation in squalls that turned lesser fleets into wreckage. In those first days, voices carried from ship to ship across the water, the ordinary calling and answering of a fleet under way. The drums were confident. The stroke was steady. Men worked the rigging with the casual competence of sailors who had long since stopped being afraid of the sea they knew. That changed on the 7th morning. There was no announcement, no storm, no shift of sky. The sea simply changed the way old things change. Without asking permission, the color went first, from the blue-black of the narrow sea, deep and familiar, to something that had no useful name in the vocabulary of southern sailors. Flat, gray-green, the texture of old pewter left in a drawer and forgotten, the same color in every direction, horizon to horizon, as though the sea had stopped trying to be beautiful and decided to be honest instead. The air tasted different. Something ancient was in it, something vast, like breathing the inside of a mountain that had been cold since before the Andals crossed the sea. It sat at the back of the throat and did not warm, and a man who pulled it in deeply enough felt it settle in his chest like something that intended to stay. On the 3rd night past the transition, a rigger sent below for his watch reported that the lines above the topmost yard had gone stiff, not the ordinary salt stiffness of any working ship at sea, stiff like iron. The ice had found them in the dark, working quietly into the hemp while the men slept, and had left a white rind across every surface above a tall man's reach. By dawn it had melted, but slowly, too slowly for the latitude the charts said they were holding. The low voices began after that, not the voices of frightened men. These were the hardest sailors the Stormlands had ever produced, and Stannis did not keep frightened men in his service. These were the voices of experienced men encountering something outside their experience, which is a different kind of quiet, the kind that passes from man to man without anyone choosing to pass it. Stannis watched it from the rail and said nothing. Sir Imry Florent found him there on the 9th day. He was a careful man, Imry, the carefulness of someone who had spent years learning the exact shape of the space around Stannis Baratheon and had committed those measurements to memory in the interest of his own continued health. He came to the rail with the bearing of a man approaching something he expected to push back. His cloak was sea-stained at the hem. His face, narrow and sharp-featured, with the Florent ears that were the family's most honest gift to its children, was arranged into something adjacent to neutrality. "The men are asking questions," Imry said. "The men should sail their ships. They are sailing their ships, they are also asking where the ships are going." He paused. Recalculated, "I am asking where the ships are going." Stannis looked at the water. A mass of ice the size of a draft horse drifted past the hull 20 feet out, translucent, blue-white against the gray, moving in absolute silence through the surface slush with a gentleness that had no business belonging to something that large. It did not collide with anything. It simply moved, unhurried, going wherever the current took it. The gentleness of it was somehow worse than an impact would have been. "We sail toward a king," Stannis said. "When I require your opinion on which destination takes precedence, I will inform you." Imry looked at the ice. His jaw moved once, settled. "The men have families," he said. The tone of a man building an argument he already knows will not be received well, and building it anyway because someone has to, and it appears he has been elected. "The shivering sea in late season, my lord, the charts above the sisters are merchant estimates. We have no reliable depth soundings past White Harbor's outer bay. If conditions worsen and we cannot make a harbor—" "Conditions will worsen," Stannis said. "We will make the harbor. At least tell me what we're sailing toward." Stannis turned from the water. He looked at Imry Florent with gray eyes that had never once offered warmth as a substitute for directness, and said, "A king." Then he walked back toward the stern. Imry stood at the rail with the ice drifting past and did not follow, because there was nothing to follow that statement with. Either the man walking away from him was correct, and there was a king at the end of this heading, in which case the voyage was necessary and the discomfort of the men was irrelevant, or he was not correct. And arguing with Stannis Baratheon had never once in Imry Florent's experience produced a different outcome than the one Stannis had already decided on. The ice thickened across the days that followed. Not pack ice, not yet, but the surface slush built up enough that the oars had to be worked harder on the pull, each stroke dragging through something that resisted. The hull produced a sound no man aboard had heard a hull make before. A grinding hiss, continuous and low, running the full length of the keel as though the sea were leaning into the wood to test it. The drummer adjusted the stroke rate without instruction, dropping the count to compensate for drag. Even the drums sounded wrong here. In southern waters they had rolled out broad and carrying, reaching ship to ship with easy authority, each beat arriving clean and full. Here the sky swallowed them, the same volume, the same drums, and the sound traveled half the distance before it died. Absorbed, the flat gray above them taking everything offered and returning nothing. The sailor in the crow's nest of the second galley saw it first. He opened his mouth, the sound he started to make, some form of a shout, the natural declaration of a man who has seen something the men below have not, stopped before it shaped itself into words. Because the wall does not process as something to announce. It processes as something that makes announcement feel inadequate. 700 feet of ice rising from the black shoreline in a straight line that extended in both directions past the point where the curve of the world consumed it. Blue-white and ancient, not the blue-white of the flows nudging the hull, a deeper color, a compressed color, centuries of cold stored in a single mass, the accumulated cold of thousands of winters pressed together until it had its own gravity. It did not look like something men had built. Walls were human things, scaled to human conflict, raised against dangers that could be negotiated with. This was something else. This was the line where the world had made a decision about itself. The fleet went quiet, ship by ship, north to south, as each crew raised their eyes and understood what they were looking at. The conversation stopped. The drumbeat on the command galley dropped a count. The drummer faltering, catching himself, finding the rhythm again 2 beats late. The first time in 9 days he had missed a stroke. At the base of the wall, barely distinguishable from the rock it was built against, Eastwatch by the sea. Black stone. Gray ice. So perfectly colorless it read as landscape rather than architecture, as though the towers had not been constructed but had simply grown from the shore the way stone grows, slowly, over centuries hardening into something that would stand until the world ended. The fleet held its heading. The oars pulled through the slush. The drums found their beat again. They sailed on toward it. The morning smelled of porridge and crow droppings, and the particular cold of a place where stone and ice have shared walls for 8,000 years. Castle Black rose around the training yard in all its graceless bulk. No beauty in it, no pretension of beauty. Just mass and function and the accumulated weight of a structure that had been absorbing northern wind since before the Seven Kingdoms had that name. And on this morning, it was noisier than usual, the recruits moving through the yard with the self-conscious tidiness of young men who had been told to be presentable and were making their most sincere effort at it. The vow ceremony was 2 hours away. Jon Snow stood apart from the others with a practice sword in his hand, moving through forms he had done so many times they lived below conscious thought. He was not thinking about the words he would say before the heart tree. He was thinking about the sword, the weight of it. The grip worn smooth along the seam where his palm met the wood, shaped by months of use, fitted to his hand in the specific way objects fit people when enough time and effort have passed between them. After the ceremony he would give it back. He would hold no property. He would be a sword himself, owned, directed, fixed to a post at the top of the world, and this practice blade would go to whoever came next. He moved through the last form. The yard crows watched from the walls with their flat black eyes unbothered by everything. Then the outer gates opened. He heard the hooves before he saw the men, the particular sound of armored horses moving in organized column, not the loose scatter of stray riders out of Eastwatch. This was formation, purpose. He lowered the practice sword. Around him the other recruits slowed their business, turning. 20 mounted men rode in through the gate in double column. Their armor was Baratheon, the crowned stag on every shield, the black and gold of the direct house, not a vassal's banner. At their head, a man who did not look left or right as he entered, who took in the yard with the comprehensive economy of someone accustomed to arriving in places that had not prepared for him. Sir Alistair Thorne appeared at the armory door with his usual expression of managed contempt, which faltered when he registered the shields. Lord Commander Mormont came from the far end of the yard with the rolling stride of a man carrying 40 years of accumulated duty in his frame, and stopped when the crowned stag banner resolved itself into something real and present. In the whole of Jorah Mormont's time at Castle Black, 2 royal visits had been worth recording. He had received communications. He had not received this. He adjusted his expression toward the nearest approximation of welcome it could manage and walked to the column's head. "Lord Stannis," he said. Castle Black did not receive. "No," Stannis said, "it did not." He dismounted without assistance, boots meeting the yard stone with the flat sound of a man who required no ceremony around his arrivals. He looked at Mormont without warmth and without hostility. the look of someone for whom neither response served the present purpose. "I require the man named Jon Snow." Mormont's eyes moved across the recruits. Jon was already looking at Stannis. He still had the practiced sword at his side. He was 16 years old, dressed in the black wool of a recruit who had not yet spoken his vows, standing in the cold of a northern morning with the smell of 100 men's breakfast still sitting in the air around him. Stannis had known, in the abstract, what to expect. He had the boy's age, his coloring from letters, his history from a maester's records. He had built a picture from available material. The picture had not prepared him for Lyanna Stark's face on a 16-year-old boy. She was in the cheekbones. The gray eyes, not Ned Stark's gray, were not only his, the shade deeper, closer to the color of the sky before a storm breaks. The particular quality of stillness the boy was holding himself in while he was being assessed. The stillness of someone who had learned early how to wait without flinching. But the jaw was Rhaegar's, the set of the shoulders, and something Stannis had not anticipated finding, because it had not been in any description or report. The boy was meeting his gaze without dropping it and without raising his chin in challenge. Not deference, not defiance. Simply the self-possession of someone who had decided, at some point and without drama, that they were permitted to look back. Stannis walked to him. Jon Snow did not move. "Jon Snow," Stannis said. "My lord." Stannis reached inside his cloak, produced the scroll, the thick parchment, the seal gone brown, the weight of 16 stored years. He placed it in Jon's free hand without preamble or softening. "Read it." Jon looked at the seal. At the age of the document in his palm, he broke it open with the hand that was not holding the sword, unrolled it, and read. Stannis watched his face do what his own had not. It changed. The boy had not yet learned, or had not yet decided to keep his face closed. The expression crumpled, brief and involuntary, a compression around the eyes and the corners of the mouth, the face of someone absorbing a blow they had no preparation for, and then it rebuilt itself, smoothed, reassembled from the inside, with visible effort, like a man pressing a wound closed with his own hands. He looked up. "This is true," Stannis said. "You are Aegon Targaryen, sixth of his name, true-born son of Rhaegar Targaryen, crown prince of the Seven Kingdoms, and Lyanna Stark of Winterfell. You are not a bastard, you never were." The yard held its breath. The recruits on the edges of it had stopped their morning business without deciding to. The crows on the walls watched. Jon Snow said, "Robb." One word, the name of his brother, the whole of something enormous compressed into 2 letters. The boy who had grown up beside him knowing him as a bastard and treating him as blood anyway, and now the blood had been reclassified by a document without Robb's knowledge, without warning, and Jon was holding the evidence in one hand and the sword he was about to give up forever in the other, and the first thing his mind produced was not the throne or the war or the name Targaryen. It was his brother's name. "Lord Robb is your cousin by blood," Stannis said. "That is a conversation for Winterfell." Jon looked at the scroll, at the cramped ecclesiastical script of Maynard's registry entry, at the second letter, the thinner paper, the handwriting of a frightened girl he had never seen before and recognized in his chest rather than his eyes. The way you recognize things that were always yours. "You're telling me the rebellion was wrong," he said. "I'm telling you it was premised on a falsehood," Stannis said. "Your mother was not taken against her will. She chose to go. They were married under the faith, witnessed and sealed. The child born of that marriage has rights the law does not extinguish because a war was fought in ignorance of them. The law does not change because a falsehood has been maintained for 16 years. Jon looked at him, at the gray eyes with their iron undertones, the jaw set like something carved rather than grown. The face of a man who had spent a long night taking himself apart and was presenting the result without apology. "Your claim," Jon said. "You were going to be king, yes. This ends that, yes. And you came here anyway." Stannis said nothing. The answer was the presence itself. 30 ships, the shivering sea, the scroll against his ribs for 9 days. A man who had everything to gain from one fire and a quiet burial, from the kennels at the yard's far edge. A shape moved, ghost crossed the stones in the silence he carried everywhere, white against gray, each step placed without sound. He came to Jon's side and sat. His eyes found Stannis, the ember-red irises, the direct and unhurried assessment of something that did not evaluate by the same measures as men, that read intention at a depth words could not reach. Stannis looked back. The direwolf held his gaze for a long moment, working through whatever calculation it was running, and appeared to reach a conclusion. It pressed its flank against Jon's leg and looked away, satisfied. In the silence that followed, Jon Snow, who had never been Jon Snow, who had been Aegon Targaryen in a bastard's clothes for 16 years without knowing it, still had the practice sword in his hand. He had not set it down through any of this. He would not notice that until Stannis had ridden away. Stannis said, "Your Grace," quietly, each word placed with the deliberate weight of a man who understood precisely what he was laying down. Jon flinched. It moved through him like a blade finding cold water. A brief, complete contraction, the body's honest answer to something the mind had not finished receiving. It was the first time. It was the last time. The Raven arrived before the ceremony was officially cancelled. Mormont's Solar was a room built for function and nothing else. Stone walls without tapestry, a fire that took the sharpest edge off the cold without eliminating it. Shelves of maps and ledgers worn soft at the corners from years of handling. It smelled of tallow candles and old parchment, and the particular staleness of a room where difficult decisions were made and then lived with. Jon sat at the edge of a chair and did not lean back. Stannis stood at the window. Between them, on the desk, the scroll lay open where Jon had set it, the cracked seal and the dead girl's handwriting visible in the firelight. Then Maester Aemon's steward knocked and entered, and placed a second parchment on the desk without ceremony, and left. Jon read it. He went still in the way that still things go still. Not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of something that has stopped in the instant before it moves. His eyes moved through the words twice. The fire did its small work in the grate. Outside the window, the crows on the wall had started their morning noise. "My father is in the black cells," Jon said. Jon looked up. Something in the quality of that single syllable, not surprise, not the appropriate reluctance of someone receiving news, registered. "You knew." "I calculated it," Stannis said. "Ned Stark would be arrested the moment Joffrey took the throne. Your father has too much honor to bend the knee to a false king. He would refuse the confession. He would refuse to legitimize Joffrey's claim with his own submission, and Cersei cannot afford a man of Ned Stark's credibility walking free in King's Landing with what he knows." He paused. "I did not tell you because the knowledge would have impaired your judgment before you were ready to use it." The anger came. Jon felt it arrive. Cold and clean. The specific Stark anger that did not heat the blood but cooled it, that did not cloud the eyes but sharpened them. He looked at Stannis and recognized in the man's expression that Stannis had anticipated this response exactly, had calculated it as he had calculated everything else, and had decided the cost was acceptable. Jon took the anger and placed it somewhere deep and internal, somewhere it would keep without spoiling. There would be time for it later. "What happens to him," Jon said, "if I don't act?" Stannis did not soften it. He dies. Cersei needs an execution to establish Joffrey's authority. A confession and a public beheading, Lord Stark naming himself a traitor before the city, legitimizes a reign that has no other legitimate foundation. She will wait for the confession. If it does not come willingly, it will come under duress. If it does not come under duress, they will kill him without it, and construct the narrative afterward. "And if I act, if I ride south, if you are king," Stannis said, "Ned Stark cannot be held for treason against the king whose son he spent 16 years protecting. The charge inverts entirely. The Lannisters will have imprisoned the most loyal servant of the rightful crown. That is not a position of strength. It is a hostage they are holding without understanding they hold it. The leverage belongs to you, not to them." Jon stood. He moved to the window and stood beside Stannis and looked out at Castle Black's yard, at the recruits who had dispersed when the ceremony was called off, drifting back to their daily assignments, with the slightly lost quality of men whose mourning had been restructured without explanation. He thought about his father in the dark. "We need to send a raven," Jon said, "to Winterfell." The rookery was at the top of one of Castle Black's older towers, reached by a staircase that had been worn into a shallow dish at the center of each step by 8,000 years of men going up and down it. The smell hit before the door opened. Bird dung and old straw and the sharp mineral bite of ink, layered over the deeper smell of feathers and enclosed space. 100 ravens shifted on their perches at the entry, a dry rustle of wings filling the tower like the sound of something waking up. Maester Aemon was already there. He had been told enough by his steward to understand that normal procedures had been suspended, and he had the calm of a very old man for whom suspension of normal procedures was familiar territory. Mormont stood near the window. He had not spoken since the Solar. He was not the sort of man who spoke when he had nothing useful to add, which Jon was beginning to recognize as a quality worth more than it appeared. Jon sat at the writing desk. Stannis took up a position at his shoulder, not hovering, not directing, but present in the way an anchor is present, something fixed against which to measure your position. Jon picked up the quill, dipped it, set it against the parchment. He wrote 4 words and stopped. Crossed them out, the ink smeared. He wrote 3 more sentences, read them back, and crossed those out too. Too much explanation, too many words, the instinct of someone who did not yet trust the reader to follow without being led. He could hear, without meaning to, the boy he had been 6 hours ago constructing those sentences. The bastard who had spent 16 years learning to explain himself to rooms that had already made up their minds. He set that boy aside, picked up the quill again. The final draft took 7 minutes. It was 6 sentences. To Robb Stark, Lord of Winterfell, I am not your brother. I am your king. My name is Aegon Targaryen, and I have proof. Lord Stannis Baratheon has the documents. If you love your father, march to Moat Cailin. I will meet you there. Jon. Stannis read it over his shoulder. The silence lasted long enough that Jon began to wonder if something needed changing. Good, Stannis said. By any other man's measure, it would have been a minimal response. By Stannis Baratheon's measure, it was lavish. Maester Aemon rolled the parchment, tied it, and fixed it to the raven's leg with practiced hands that had done this 10,000 times and did not require eyes to manage it. He murmured something to the bird, old habit or old courtesy, something between a man and an animal that had shared a tower for years. The raven turned its head once, the complete rotation that ravens make when they are deciding whether the world deserves their attention. Then Aemon carried it to the window and opened his hands. The bird was gone into the gray sky of the north. It arrived 2 days later, at dawn. The great hall of Winterfell in the early morning had its own particular atmosphere, wood smoke drifting from fires that had been feeding all night, the warm breath fog of 30 men condensing in cold air, the dogs under the long tables who had not yet been moved on and were still pressed against the stone floor in their various sleeping arrangements. It smelled of old rushes and last night's supper, and the wet wool of cloaks hung near the hearth to dry. Robb Stark sat at the head table with Grey Wind at his feet. He had been there since before full light. He was 16 years old, and his father was in the black cells of the Red Keep, and every lord in the north had been sending ravens to Winterfell for 3 days, asking the same question Robb did not yet have an answer to. Maester Luwin came through the side door at a pace that was not quite running. He placed the raven's message in Robb's hand without preface. The parchment was crumpled at one corner where it had met weather on the journey, and the ink at the 3rd line had bled slightly where moisture had found it, but the words were legible, all 6 sentences. Robb read it once, then he read it again. His face did not collapse, it did not perform the shock the words deserved. It moved through something, a series of internal recalculations, visible in the small adjustments around his eyes and jaw, the face of a young lord processing 2 simultaneous pieces of news that each individually would have been enough to redirect the course of his life. He sat with it, he held it, and then something settled in his expression that had not been there before, something harder and quieter than anything that had been there when he woke up this morning. The great Jon Umber was at the lower table with his breakfast in front of him. He had not been given the letter. It had gone to Robb directly, Maester Luwin's hands to Robb's hands and no further. He was watching Robb's face instead, the way experienced men read a room by watching the man who matters, and what he saw in Robb's expression told him everything the parchment said, and more. He set down his cup. The hall had gone quiet, not all at once, table by table, conversation by conversation, men reading the room and finding it changed without being told what had changed. 30 men's breath rising in the cold air, 30 men sitting very still. Robb looked up. He looked at the great Jon, at Glover, at Karstark across the hall, at the men who had ridden to Winterfell these past 3 days asking their unanswered question. How long, Robb said, to march to Moat Cailin? Moat Cailin was not a castle in any sense that word implied grandeur. It was 3 towers and a bog, ancient, crumbling, leaning slightly into the soft earth beneath them as though exhausted by the effort of standing since the age of heroes. The stonework had gone black with centuries of damp. The mortar between the blocks had been replaced so many times it had layers, each generation's repairs visible in the different shades of gray. A geological record of every time the realm had decided this place still needed to exist. Around it, the fens stretched in every direction. Flat, dark water interrupted by islands of reed and sedge grass, the whole of it alive with midges and the distant percussion of frogs. It smelled of rot and standing water and late summer insects, a living smell, the smell of a place that had been decomposing slowly for thousands of years and had no intention of finishing. More conquerors had died in the Neck than before any castle in the Seven Kingdoms. The bog took armies the way stone walls could not. It was, in this way, a fitting place to build something new. The northern lords arrived from the North Road with their banners in the grey morning, Umber, Karstark, Glover, Manderly the direwolf of House Stark at the column's head. Stannis's force arrived from the south an hour later, 30 Stormlands banners snapping in the wet wind off the fens, the crowned stag of House Baratheon above them all. Between the two approaching columns, already at the towers, a figure in northern riding clothes stood with a white direwolf at his side. Jon Snow was no longer wearing black. He was not yet wearing anything that announced itself. Brown wool, riding leathers, a northern cloak against the neck's particular chill, the clothes of a man from somewhere cold, not the clothes of a king and not the clothes of a bastard. Between those two things was where he stood, precisely and without apology, watching both camps arrive and letting them arrive and not moving to either. Ghost sat beside him. From the northern column, Grey Wind emerged ahead of the riders and crossed the wet ground to Jon's position at a lope and sat. Grey direwolf and white direwolf, shoulder to shoulder. They did not look at each other. They looked outward at the assembled lords with the shared gravity of animals that had been companions in some previous existence, and recognized the arrangement as correct. Robb Stark rode to the front of his column, saw Jon, saw Ghost, saw Grey Wind sitting beside Ghost, and said nothing for a moment. Then he dismounted and walked across the wet ground and stopped in front of his brother, who was not his brother who had sent him a letter 6 days ago saying, "I am your king," in handwriting he had known since childhood. They looked at each other. The adjustment was still happening in Robb's face. It would keep happening. Jon recognized this because the same adjustment was still happening in his own chest. "Jon," Robb said, there was a great deal more in those 2 syllables than either of them would say in front of 30 lords and 30 soldiers. They would save it. There would be time. The great Jon Umber was already dismounting. He was an enormous man, the great Jon, the kind of large that made other large men renegotiate their assumptions about scale. He walked like someone who had decided gravity was a suggestion. His beard was the color and consistency of a bird's nest after a storm, and his voice, when he used it, carried the specific authority of a man who had never been asked to repeat himself. He planted himself in front of Jon Snow and looked down at a boy in brown wool standing in a bog and said, "You want us to kneel to a Targaryen, after what Aerys did." Not a question, a statement with a door in it left open to see what came through. Jon had been thinking about this for 6 days on the road. He had thought about every version of this challenge, the loud version, the cold version, the version that came with a sword already half drawn, and had worked through each of them the way Stannis had taught him to approach maps. Not where you want to go, but where the ground actually is. "The Mad King was my grandfather," Jon said. "I didn't choose my grandfather." He let that settle for a moment. The great Jon's jaw moved. "You didn't choose yours either, and from what I understand, his idea of diplomacy involved burning his neighbor's barn." Something shifted in the great Jon's expression. Not amusement. The great Jon was not yet ready to find any part of this amusing, but a recalibration. He had expected deflection or formality. He had not expected to be answered in the same register he had used. "I am the son of Rhaegar," Jon continued, "who everyone who knew him says was a good man. I have not yet met a person who knew him and says otherwise. And I am the nephew of Ned Stark, who I watched be a good man every day of my life. I am half Stark, my lord. I am not asking you to trust the half you don't know. I am asking you to fight for the half you already do." The great Jon looked at him for a long moment, looked at Robb, looked at Ghost. He did not kneel, not yet, but he stepped back and the space he left said something. Rickard Karstark did not fill it with volume. He was gray and cold, the bearing of a man who trusted slowly and forgot nothing, and he moved to stand before Jon with the same deliberate economy he brought to everything, words included. "You are Rhaegar's son," Karstark said. "Rhaegar died at the Trident, fighting my king." Not accusation, statement. The weight in it was old and packed down hard, the weight of a man who had sworn oaths and watched the world he swore them to collapse around him, and was deciding whether to swear again. "Your king was Robert Baratheon," Jon said. "Not the Lannisters. Robert is dead. Joffrey is a bastard born of incest, and his name is not Baratheon in any sense the law would recognize. He let that stand for a moment before continuing. Stannis Baratheon stands behind me, Robert's own brother, the man who has more cause than anyone in this bog to want the throne for himself, and who chose the law over his own claim because he is Stannis Baratheon and he does not look away from what is true. Jon held Karstark's gaze. He swore the same oaths to Robert's memory that you did. He has agreed that the law supersedes personal grief. Can you? Karstark was silent for long enough that the frogs in the nearest fen were audible. Then he stepped back. Robb Stark had been standing at the edge of it. He had watched the great Jon, watched Karstark, watched Manderly's shrewd eyes moving between Jon and the assembled men, with the calculating patience of someone who was doing arithmetic about which investment had the better return. He had watched his brother, his cousin, stand in the middle of a bog in brown wool and answer every challenge with the specific gravity of someone who had earned the right to stand still. He walked to the center. He turned to face the lords of the north, the men who had ridden to Winterfell these past weeks asking unanswered questions, who had followed him here because his father was in the black cells and the realm needed deciding. My father taught me the North remembers, Robb said. The North remembers the Targaryens, who burned Lord Rickard and strangled Lord Brandon in chains. That is a true memory, and I am not asking you to forget it. He looked at Jon. The adjustment still moved in his face, subtle and continuous, the ongoing work of a 16-year-old recalibrating 16 years at once. The North also remembers that Lyanna Stark was my father's sister. She died giving birth to this man. She died asking my father to keep him safe. He looked back at the assembled lords. My father kept that promise for 16 years at cost to his own name and his own honor. If Ned Stark believed this was worth that, if Ned Stark believed Jon was worth that, then I trust my father's judgment. I have always trusted my father's judgment. He walked to Jon, held his gaze for a moment, then he went to one knee. My king, Robb said. The sound that followed was armored men kneeling. Not cloth on soft ground. This was wet stone and iron, 30 men in plate and mail finding their knees in the bog of the neck. And the sound it made was 100 small sounds compacting into one large one, buckle and pauldron and vambrace meeting the ground in overlapping registers. The great Jon's enormous frame going down last among the northern lords, with the force of a man who committed fully to everything he did, mud splashing from the impact of one massive knee. Stannis Baratheon knelt last. He did it without announcement, without the small preparatory signals most men use before they go to a knee. He simply went down, clean and economical, the way he did everything. His knee met the wet ground with a flat sound. He would have mud on his breeches for the rest of the day. He would not mention it. My king, Stannis said. Then, quiet enough that only Jon could hear. Don't make me regret this. Jon looked down at him, at the gray eyes with their iron undertones, the jaw that had been set against the world since before Jon was born, the face of a man who had given away his life's work in a rookery in Dragonstone, and was now completing the gesture in front of witnesses. You already regret it, Jon said. That's why I trust you. Something moved across Stannis Baratheon's face. Not a smile, not quite, the ghost of the possibility of one, present for less than a breath, gone before anyone else in the bog had the chance to register it. Then it was gone, and Stannis Baratheon was Stannis Baratheon again, and the assembled lords of the north and the Stormlands knelt in the mud of the neck. 30,000 people did not march. They moved. The distinction mattered more than it sounded. A march implied order, column, the dressed ranks of men who knew their place in a formation and held it. What 30,000 people actually did on 40 days of King's Road was something closer to a slow migration, a vast, straggling organism of bodies and animals and wagons and supply lines and interhouse grievances and men with blisters who couldn't find their sergeants, all of it generating a constant rough music that was nothing like parade drums. It was mud sound and cartwheel creak and the low argument of tired men negotiating who owed whom what favor from 3 camps back. It was wood smoke in the morning from 1,000 cook fires and the smell of the riverlands coming up through it, rich loam, the green-brown breath of trident tributaries swelling in late summer, a warmth the earth put out in these southern fields that the north simply did not possess. Stannis used every day. Day 5, dawn. The tent was cold and the maps were on the floor because the field desk wasn't large enough. Stannis was already dressed, already at work, his single candle casting its economy of light across the carved geography of the 7 kingdoms. He wrote everything himself. Small, precise strokes of the pen. Nothing wasted, no flourish. Jon crouched at the map's edge and studied the roads south. The King's Road here, Stannis said without looking up. Harrenhal here, the Trident here. The combined host needs to overwinter somewhere defensible before we commit to the Blackwater approach. Where do you hold? Jon looked at the map, at the size of Harrenhal's icon, the largest castle in Westeros. Harrenhal is cursed, architecturally unstable and impossible to heat. Its great hall requires 40 fires burning simultaneously to raise the temperature to merely unpleasant. Every man who has ever held it has come to grief. Every single one, without exception, going back to the Black Dread's dragonfire melting the original stones. Stannis's pen moved. Where else? Jon studied the map, looked at the rivers, the distances, the position of the Tully seat at River Run. Tully control, defensible on the water sides. The fords provide approach options north and south. Better, Stannis said. That was the whole of the affirmation. He moved on to the next problem. This was how he taught. Not by providing answers, by removing wrong ones until only the right one remained, and letting the student understand the shape of the gap that had been filled. Jon learned, by day 5, to think about what Stannis was not saying as carefully as what he was. Day 12, rain. The Tully contingent arrived from the west in weather that had been making the Riverlands miserable for 3 days. Edmure Tully at its head. Catelyn Stark's brother, young and earnest and visibly relieved to have found them, leading his riders in with the energy of a man who has been riding hard and is pleased with himself for arriving at all. He was 3 days late. The advance guard had waited at the ford. Jon rode out to meet him personally, which he did not have to do and which Edmure registered with wide eyes. Lord Edmure, Jon said, your riders made excellent time in this weather. We're glad to have the Tully strength. Edmure's chest expanded. He launched into an explanation of river road conditions and the Mander flooding and the difficulties of moving cavalry through the western approach. And Jon listened with the full attention of a man who found all of it genuinely interesting, which he had learned was the cheapest and most effective form of respect. Stannis found him at the command tent an hour later. You complimented him, Stannis said, not a question, the tone of a man filing a report. He was late, but he came. You complimented him because the flattery cost you nothing, and alienating the Tully alliance cost you the Riverlands. That was correct. Stannis sat at his desk, opened the supply ledger without ceremony. Know why you're doing it. Every time. If you do the right thing by accident, you are lucky. If you do the right thing because you understood the calculation, you are competent. I need you to be competent. Jon said nothing. He was learning what questions Stannis considered worth answering, and this was not a gap requiring filling. Day 23, night. The fire had gone low. The camp outside was the particular quiet of 30,000 people asleep simultaneously. Not silence, never silence, but the managed noise of a host that had stopped all its daytime urgency suspended, replaced by snoring and horse shifting and the distant challenge of sentries at the perimeter. Jon asked the question he had been carrying for 3 weeks. What if I'm wrong? He looked at the low fire. Not about the claim. About a decision. What if I make a choice and it gets people killed? The wrong ford, the wrong ally, the wrong day to give battle. Stannis was quiet for long enough that the fire cracked once, settling. You will make mistakes, he said. You will get people killed. Every commander does, from the lowest sergeant to the king. There is no version of command that does not include this. He looked at Jon directly. The question is not whether you will err. It is whether your errors are recoverable. A king who commits all his strength to one axis of attack and is wrong loses everything. A king who keeps a reserve and is wrong loses the battle and not the war. Structure your decision so that being wrong is survivable. This is the entire discipline. That's not very reassuring, Jon said. I was not attempting to reassure you. Stannis's voice did not change register, did not soften or harden. It was simply flat and precise and honest. I was telling you the truth. Reassurance is for children and fools. You are neither. Jon looked at the fire. He thought about that for a long time afterward. Not because it frightened him, though it did, but because it was the first time anyone had said you are neither to him and meant it as a compliment. Day 31. The grain wagon problem was in the supply ledger before it became a crisis. A bottleneck at the third baggage column where the wheel gauge on 4 wagons was incompatible with a stretch of King's Road that had been repaved at a different width than the rest. The wagons were slowing the column was compressing behind them. Compressed columns generated the exact inter-house friction that caused men to start fights they would otherwise have avoided. Jon found the problem in the ledger at dawn. He spoke to the quartermaster before breakfast. By mid-morning, the problem wagons had been offloaded, redistributed across available carts from the Umber baggage train, and the column was moving again. He had not been asked to do this. He had not reported doing it. He had simply noticed and acted and moved on. Stannis learned about it through his steward at dinner. He said nothing to Jon. He poured Jon's wine himself. In Stannis Baratheon's vocabulary, that was a standing ovation. The march had its own language for who Jon was. To the lords, he was your grace, a title that still sat slightly wrong in his ear, like a boot that was the right size but needed wearing in. In official documents passing between the camps and the ravens flying south ahead of them, he was Aegon, the legal name, the name on the scroll, the name that had been his since birth, and that he had not yet worked out how to inhabit. And at night, when the fires were low and the sentries had made their rounds and Robb found him the way Robb always found him, the way he had been finding him since they were children, at Winterfell, Jon, Robb said one evening, just that, not your grace, not Aegon, Jon, the name of the boy who had sat at the low table and watched the highborn laugh. They sat without speaking for a time, which they had always been able to do. Then Robb looked at him across the fire. You look like yourself, Robb said. More like yourself than you ever did at Winterfell. Jon turned that over. He thought about what Robb was seeing. What had changed in the weeks since Castle Black? What was different now from the boy who had stood in every room at a slight angle to the door, who had measured each step for permission before taking it? He realized Robb was right. The bastard's crouch, the unconscious folding inward of a person who had spent 16 years being told they did not have the right to take up space, was gone. He could not have said when it had left. Somewhere between the neck and the Riverlands, between the first map session and the 31st day's supply problem, between Stannis' wine poured without comment and the Great Joan's knee in the Moat Cailin mud, something had changed in the way he held himself. Not pride. Pride was performative, and he had no patience for it. Not arrogance. Arrogance was a quality that made men around you smaller, and he needed the men around him at their full size. He simply stood differently now. Not proud. Just vertical. At dawn each morning, before the camp stirred, before the cook fires and the cartwheel creak and the rough music of 30,000 people remembering they existed, Jon rode out along the column's edge, with Ghost loping silent beside him in the gray light, the Riverlands opening ahead of them, the King's Road stretching south toward a city he had never seen, and a throne he had not asked for, and a war that had no clean ending. These were the last mornings of what he was. The night before, Stannis had spread the bay chart across the tent floor and explained it the way he explained everything, with the flat precision of a man who had thought through every variable and was now reporting his conclusions rather than seeking approval for them. 3 groups. Group 1 holds the harbor mouth. His finger moved across the chart without touching it, hovering above the blue-painted water. Heavy war galleys, 3 abreast. Nothing enters the city by sea. Their food supply becomes a clock. The longer the city holds, the louder that clock gets. Group 2. The finger moved left, toward the shoreline below the walls. Fast assault ships. Shallow drafted. They navigate close to the base of the wall where the heavy galleys cannot follow, and they put Stormland's troops on the ground at the mud gate before the garrison has time to redeploy from the walls to the gate approach. And Group 3, Jon said. The Fury. Stannis folded his hands behind his back and looked at the chart from a standing distance. The chain boom across the bay is the city's first defense, an iron chain stretched between towers, anchored in the bay floor, intended to stop a fleet. It has stopped fleets before. He paused. It has never been struck by ships already on fire. Jon looked at him. You don't need wildfire to burn ships, Stannis said. You need ships on fire. The silence of the tent settled around that. And the land assault, Jon said. You will be on the northern ridge above the King's Gate approach. High enough to see everything, the bay, both gate approaches, the walls. You will have runners and a signal corps. You will watch what happens, and you will give the orders that the battle requires in the moment it requires them. He looked at Jon directly. You are the king. You will not lead the charge. Jon said nothing for a moment. And if I'm needed, Robb commands the northern assault on the Lion Gate. If you are needed, it means Robb has failed, and the signal corps has failed, and the runners have failed. And at that point the battle is already lost in ways that your personal courage will not recover. Stannis' voice did not rise. It never rose. The instinct to fight alongside your men is real, and it is admirable, and it will get you killed. Control it. And if the lion gate doesn't fall? Jon asked. Then I've already breached the mud gate from the water, and the question is moot. And if your water assault fails, then Robb must take the northern gate before the garrison regroups, which is precisely why you are on the ridge rather than at the gate. Someone must be able to see both situations simultaneously and respond to whichever requires a decision. He looked at the chart one final time, then rolled it with the efficiency of a man who had finished with something and would not need to look at it again. Get some sleep. Jon did not sleep. The black water at pre-dawn was flat calm. The bay lay beneath the ridge like hammered tin, the water so still it reflected the stars without distortion, a perfect mirror that seemed improbable for something that was about to be destroyed. The air smelled of salt and mud, and the particular waterfront sourness of a city that had been generating its waste into the same estuary for centuries. Somewhere below the ridge, and to the left, 30,000 men were in position and waiting. Then the drums began. Not the Baratheon drums Jon had spent 40 days marching behind. Those had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. These were the fleet drums, a lower register carried across open water, reaching the ridge with the slight delay of sound traveling distance before it arrived. The fleet was moving. Group 1 first, the heavy galleys spreading across the harbor mouth in the dark. Then Group 2, the shallow drafted assault ships angling toward the shoreline, their silhouettes barely visible against the dark water. Then the Fury. He could see it from the ridge by the fires. 3 ships, not one. 3 vessels with their sails and rigging burning, driven forward by skeleton crews who would go over the side at the last moment. The fire turned the water around them orange, cast the chain boom ahead in amber light, and made the bay look briefly like something from a painting of a war that had happened a long time ago. The chain boom broke at dawn. It did not break the way men imagine things breaking in battle, cleanly, dramatically, with the speed of decisive action. It broke the way structural things actually break under load, with grinding, and then a deep, wrenching sound that traveled up through the bay floor into the ridge beneath Jon's horse. A physical sensation, as much as an audible one, and then a slow descent, the chain going slack, and then dropping, each link the size of a man's thigh disappearing into the black water with a hiss of steam where hot metal met cold bay. The Baratheon assault ships poured through the gap. From the ridge, the battle was information. This was what Stannis had been teaching him. Jon understood now, not tactics or strategy in the abstract, but this specific discipline, the ability to stand at sufficient distance from horror and translate it into something useful. Battle sounds reached the ridge in fragments, screaming, distant, multiple, overlapping, the specific quality of large numbers of men encountering violence simultaneously. Metal, the irregular percussion of weapons against weapons and weapons against walls. Fire, somewhere below the western approach, the soft crackling roar of something structural beginning to burn. And under all of it, the human noise of an army taking a city. Formless, massive, impossible to parse unless you are willing to stop hearing it as suffering and start hearing it as movement. Jon heard it as movement. The mudgate fell within 2 hours. The signal came up from the runner, Stormland's troops in the courtyard, garrison broken, the western approach open, and Jon relayed the pivot order to Robb's flank before the runner had finished speaking. Robb's force had been held at the Lion Gate by Lannister household troops who had no avenue of retreat and had apparently decided that dying where they stood was preferable to surrendering to a king whose name they had spent a month watching their lords argue about. They fought well. They were outnumbered 3-1, and they fought well. And Robb hit them from 2 angles, and the gate fell before noon. The pincer closed. The city was taken by the time the sun reached its midpoint. Jon rode through the Lion Gate with the gate standing open, and the bodies dragged to the sides of the road and the stones still wet from the morning's work. The Kingsguard were somewhere ahead, presumably deciding. Cersei was somewhere inside. The Iron Throne was inside, in its great hall, built from the swords of defeated kings and approximately as comfortable as that sounded. The street was not empty. People of King's Landing stood in doorways and pressed against the buildings along both sides of the road, 30 feet of space between them and the column, a corridor of silent watchers. Not cheering, not fleeing, watching. The faces were the faces of people who had lived through several changes of power and had learned the specific calculation of waiting to see which way a new thing would go before committing to any visible reaction. Old men in the doorways, women with children pressed close, a dog that had not been moved. Jon rode and did not perform anything for them. He did not raise a hand or project a smile or do any of the things that men who needed to be loved did when they entered cities. He looked ahead. He sat straight in the saddle. He was 16 years old, and he had just taken King's Landing without wildfire, without the burning of 20,000 men, without the desperate chaos of a battle that should not have been won. And nothing in his face announced any of this. A woman somewhere to the right threw a flower. It came from a window above the street level. A single stem, something that had been growing in a pot, pale against the gray stone of the building. It landed on the road at his horse's feet without sound, immediately displaced by the next hoofstep, pressing into the wet stone. Jon did not look down at it. He looked ahead, at the red keep rising against the morning sky. The city was not won yet. The city was taken. That was different. Taken was the military fact. Won was the slower, harder work that started now, in the throne room with the people who had survived the morning and were waiting to learn what surviving had cost them. He rode on. The throne room doors had been forced. Not broken. The wood was old and iron-bound and had resisted, but forced. The hinges bent at the top, where men with a ram had applied themselves for 20 minutes until the iron gave enough for the doors to swing inward, with a groan that carried through the whole of the Red Keep, like something in pain. Jon walked through them with Stannis at his right shoulder and 30 armed men at his back, and stopped. He had been told about the Iron Throne. Everyone had been told about the Iron Throne. The telling was insufficient. It was not a throne in any sense the word implied comfort, or dignity, or the considered expression of royal authority. It was a pile, a mass of swords from the conquered kingdoms of Aegon's enemies, melted by Balerion the Black Dread's fire and re-solidified into something that had the approximate shape of a seat if you were charitable in your interpretation and had never actually tried to sit in it. Blades jutted from every surface, the back rose 15 feet in irregular spikes, the armrests were edged with steel that had drawn blood from every king who had grown careless with it. The iron had gone dark with age, and the particular discoloration of surfaces that have absorbed a great deal over a great many years, and beneath the smell of the room, old stone, candle wax, the cold that the high windows let in from above, there was something else, something older, the ghost of blood in the stone, too much history soaked into the floor to scrub out. Jon looked at it for a long moment, then he walked to stand in front of it. Not on it, before it. He turned to face the room. That choice, that refusal to mount the steps and sit, was its own statement. He did not announce it as a statement. He simply stood. Jaime Lannister had held the throne room with 40 household guards. They were arranged in a line before the dais when Jon entered, shields up, swords drawn, the professional arrangement of men who understood that they were not going to win and had decided to make the losing as expensive as possible. Jaime stood at their center in his white Kingsguard armor. The white was still white. Jon noticed, unstained despite the mourning, with his sword in hand, and the specific expression of a man conducting an internal calculation at high speed. Jon stopped 10 feet from the line. Stannis stopped beside him. He reached inside his cloak and held out the scroll. Jaime looked at it, at the brown seal, the age of the parchment. He took 3 steps forward and took it from Jon's hand and unrolled it, and read it. 30 seconds. Perhaps less. He was by every account the most intelligent fighter alive, a man who processed situations the way ordinary men processed sentences, in complete units of meaning rather than word by word. He read the scroll, read the seal, read the registry entry, and the calculation finished in his face with the slight flicker of a man who has arrived at a sum he did not want to arrive at. He sheathed his sword. Behind him, the 40 guards looked at each other and made their individual decisions in the space of 2 heartbeats. Swords went down, shields were grounded. Jaime handed the scroll back. "Well," he said, "this is not the morning I expected to have." They brought the prisoners to the throne room in order of political significance, which meant Joffrey first. He was 12 years old. Jon had understood this as a fact, but had not fully inhabited it until the boy was standing 10 feet away, 12 years old, in clothes that had been fine before the morning and were now rumpled, his golden hair disordered, his green eyes, his father's eyes, not a trace of Baratheon in them, moving between Jon and Stannis and the scroll and the assembled men, with the specific bewilderment of a person whose entire model of the world had been invalidated simultaneously. Not cowardice, not the performance of bravery, something more fundamental, the genuine incomprehension of a child who had been told he was the rightful king since before he could fully understand what that meant, told it by everyone around him, told it with the complete confidence that comes from people who believe it, and who was now looking at evidence that all of it had been wrong and did not have the architecture to process that information. Cersei came in behind him. She was not crying. The deliberateness of that was visible. The set of her jaw, the slight elevation of her chin, the specific composure of a person using every reserve of will they possess to deny their audience the satisfaction of a public grief. Her hands were clasped in front of her, fingers interlaced, the rings she wore catching the available light from the high windows. She looked at Jon. She studied his face the way a person studies a map of terrain they are going to need to navigate later. Comprehensive, systematic, filing details. "He looks like Ned Stark," she said, quietly. Not to anyone in particular. A statement to the room, or to herself, or perhaps simply the honest acknowledgement of someone who prided herself on seeing clearly. Jaime, standing to her left with his sword surrendered and his white cloak slightly dusty from the morning, said nothing. He was watching Jon with the same calculating attentiveness, but where Cersei's face was reading Jon as a future problem, Jaime's was reading him as a present one, the kind of fast tactical assessment that never fully stopped in men trained the way Jaime had been trained. Stannis stepped forward. He looked at the prisoners, at Joffrey and Cersei and Jaime, with the gray eyes that had been looking at problems requiring solution for 34 years, and had not yet found a problem that required warmth rather than precision. "Joffrey of House Lannister," he said. The name, not the title. The title had been stripped the moment the scroll was authenticated. "Cersei of House Lannister, you stand accused of high treason, the conspiracy to place a child of illegitimate birth upon the Iron Throne, the suppression of the legitimate succession, the murder of Jon Arryn by proxy." He paused. He was not performing this. He was reporting it. "The penalty under the law of the Seven Kingdoms is death." He looked at Jon. Jon looked at Joffrey. The boy was 12 years old, and he had been given cruelty as a tool since before he understood what tools were for, and he had used it the way a child uses anything handed to them by the adults in their life, without full comprehension of the weight of what he was holding. He was vicious. He was spoiled. He was capable, Jon was almost certain, of becoming something worse than he currently was, and he had never once in his entire life been given a different option. Jon looked at Cersei. She did not look away. She held his gaze with everything she had left, which was still considerable, and she waited. He thought of Ned Stark in the dark of a cell, alive because the leverage had inverted. He thought of something Ned had said once, years ago, in Winterfell's yard, not to Jon directly, but to Robb within Jon's hearing. The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. Not a lesson about execution, a lesson about what justice cost, and who was required to pay it. Justice was not clean. "The wall," Jon said. Stannis's jaw tightened. The only tell he had, the single movement that registered what passed through him when something was not what he would have chosen. "Joffrey to the wall," Jon continued. "He will take the oath before the heart tree and live out his life as a sworn brother of the Night's Watch. He will never rule, never marry, never father children. The Lannister line ends with him." He looked at Cersei. Lady Cersei will be confined at Dragonstone. Not executed, not free. She will be housed, fed, treated with the dignity appropriate to her birth. He paused. She will not leave. He looked at Jaime. "Lord Jaime's Kingsguard oaths are dissolved. They were sworn to a false king, and the king is gone. He is a knight without a commission. He may go to Casterly Rock and assist his father in preparing whatever comes next." The throne room was quiet. "Your Grace." Stannis's voice, when he finally used it, was level. The level of a man holding something in. "You are releasing the Kingslayer." "I am sending him home," Jon said, "to tell Tywin Lannister that mercy is possible, and to find out whether Tywin Lannister is wise enough to accept it. The law requires—" "I know what the law requires." Jon turned to face him fully, not in challenge, not in the way a boy turns to defy an adult, but squarely the way a man stands before the person he has been trained by and demonstrates what the training produced. "You told me the king is the source of the law, that the law does not exist independent of the crown. It flows from the crown, through the courts, through the judgments of the sovereign. You told me this." He held Stannis's gaze. "I am the law, Lord Stannis, and I am choosing this." The throne room was very quiet. Something moved in Stannis Baratheon's iron eyes. Frustration, real, genuine frustration, the kind that lives in a man who has been correct about something and watched the correct thing be set aside. And behind it, slow and reluctant as ice moving in spring, something else, something that looked from a certain angle like the faintest edge of recognition. The student had learned the lesson, had turned it in a direction the teacher had not intended. "So be it," Stannis said. 2 months after King's Landing fell, the Riverlands pacified with the speed of people who had been reading the situation accurately since the day the Baratheon fleet appeared in Blackwater Bay. The Freys bent their knees. The Brackens bent their knees. Lords who had spent the previous season calculating the odds of various outcomes discovered, when the outcome arrived, that they had no remaining calculations to perform and surrendered the dignity of pretending otherwise. The combined host moved west along the Gold Road, its numbers reduced now. The northern lords had ridden home with their honors satisfied, and what remained was a hard and experienced corps of Baratheon and Tully strength, approximately 12,000 men, moving toward a castle that had never been taken. Tywin Lannister was waiting for them. He had known for 7 weeks. Jaime had come home in the 3rd week after King's Landing. Not under guard, not in chains, but riding alone with his sword at his hip, and a story Tywin had listened to in complete silence for the better part of an hour. The report had been comprehensive. Jaime was constitutionally incapable of omitting details that reflected badly on himself, and this report contained several. He read the scroll in the yard at Castle Black, Jaime said. Didn't speak for a long time. Then the first thing he said was his brother's name. Tywin had said nothing. "He's got Rhaegar's instincts," Jaime said. The slight weight in the word, not grief, but the particular tone of someone citing a person they respected and would not say so plainly. The way Rhaegar read a room. The way he made you feel that he'd already seen 3 steps past where you currently were. "He has Ned Stark's morality," Tywin said. Flat, precise. Jaime considered this, yes. Tywin looked at the fire. His eyes, green and watchful, moved through something private and complete. "He has both," he said, almost to himself. "That is a dangerous combination." Kevin Lannister, sitting across the table with his cup untouched, had been quiet through the whole of Jaime's report. He was a careful man, Kevin, the steady second pillar of the house, less brilliant than Tywin and considerably easier to be in a room with. He looked at his brother now with the careful look of a man monitoring something for change. "What do we do?" Kevin asked. Tywin said nothing. He was thinking. When Tywin Lannister was thinking, the room understood that speaking was not the correct use of the time. He thought for several days. Casterly Rock announced itself from 20 miles away on the Gold Road, not as a castle but as a geology. The cliffs rose from the Westerlands landscape with the authority of something that had been there before the land around it existed, the natural stone carved and shaped into defensibility over centuries, until the line between what the rock had decided to do on its own and what men had added to it was entirely invisible. Walls that were not built but grown from the same material they defended. The harbor at Lannisport below, where the Baratheon fleet had been sitting for 2 weeks, making the mathematics of a siege straightforward. The gold in the stone caught the afternoon light. Not symbolic gold, literal, the actual mineral trace that ran through the Westerlands rock and had built the Lannister fortune over 400 years, glinting in the cliff faces with the mild and permanent generosity of something that had no intention of running out. The Westerlands light was warmer than the north and drier than the Riverlands, a golden hour quality that softened everything it touched, that made even the hard lines of military formations look like something else. Jon studied the rock from the ridge above the road and said nothing for a long time. "We cannot take it by assault," Stannis said. He had said this already in the command tent 2 nights prior. He was saying it again to confirm the conclusion had not changed. "No," Jon agreed. The walls were solid rock, not dressed stone. You could not undermine them because there was nothing beneath them but more rock. The harbor supplied the garrison indefinitely as long as ships could reach Lannisport. A siege without a naval blockade was not a siege at all. A siege with the fleet in place became a matter of time, and time in this context meant months, possibly longer, and thousands of men sitting in the Westerlands being fed and kept from killing each other, while Tywin Lannister sat in his ancestral seat and waited them out. "Who do I send?" Jon asked. Stannis considered. "I can draft the formal communication. The legal language of the terms is specific, and not you." Jon said it without emphasis, the same way Stannis corrected him. "You're correct on the law, and you're correct on the terms, and you'll deliver them in a way that reads as a man telling Tywin Lannister what to do. Tywin will make him wait 3 days before answering just to establish the dynamic." He thought for a moment. "And not Robb. He wants this fight. Tywin will see it, and it will make the terms feel like a trap." Stannis was quiet, the quiet of a man recognizing that his student had learned to think past the obvious answer. "Edmure Tully," Jon said. "He's occasionally a fool. He's warm. Genuinely warm. Not performed warmth, actual warmth. The kind that makes people feel they've been treated fairly, even when they haven't been given everything they wanted." Jon looked at the rock. "Tywin Lannister has been managing cold intelligence his entire life. He has armor for it. He has no armor for a man who shows up at his gate with honest goodwill and reasonable terms." Stannis looked at him for a moment. "Know why you're doing it," Jon said quietly. Tywin read the letter twice. He sat at the desk in his solar at Casterly Rock, with the Lannisport harbor visible through the window, the Baratheon fleet out there, patient and permanent, the mathematical fact of the situation made visible in iron and sail, and he read the terms once for content and once for what was underneath the content. House Lannister retained Casterly Rock, all Westerland's titles and seats, his position, his wealth, his honor, no attainder, no stripping of name or lands, the gold mines subject to crown taxation but Lannister property, one hostage per generation, traditional practice, nothing punitive, full acknowledgement of Aegon VI's legitimacy, fealty sworn in person. He set the letter down. Kevin waited. Jaime, standing at the window looking at the fleet, did not turn. "Acceptable," Tywin said. Kevin stared. He had spent 2 months preparing arguments for the negotiation they were about to enter, the concessions Tywin would extract, the points of leverage, the lines that could not be crossed. The word acceptable did not appear anywhere in his preparations. Tywin looked at the letter again. At the seal, the new royal seal, Targaryen dragon and Baratheon stag interlocked, the design of a king who had spent thought on the symbol of his authority. "The boy has offered me everything I would have demanded for myself," he said. "What is there to refuse?" He was quiet for a moment, reading the letter a third time. Something moved in his face. Not admiration. Tywin Lannister did not produce admiration the way other men did. Something more precise, the recognition of a practitioner encountering quality work. "A king who offers mercy to defeated enemies consolidates faster than one who demands blood," he said. "The Riverlands houses surrendered because they calculated the risk and found it unfavorable. They will be loyal to the extent their calculation holds." He set the letter down with the finality of a man who had made his decision and moved on to implementation. A house that surrenders on terms it considers fair becomes loyal for different reasons. This boy understands the difference. He looked at Kevin. He will be a harder man to remove than any Baratheon. Jaime, at the window, said nothing. He was watching the fleet. The fealty was sworn in the outer courtyard of Casterly Rock. Under the afternoon sky, Jon stood in the courtyard with Stannis at his right, and Davos at his left, and Robb at the edge of the assembled men, and Tywin Lannister walked out from the keep's inner door and crossed the courtyard to stand before him. He was 56 years old. He had been the most powerful man in the Seven Kingdoms for most of his adult life, the architect of the Lannister supremacy, the man who had sacked King's Landing and presented the Targaryen bodies as a gift, and watched a new dynasty be built on top of what he had made possible. He walked across the courtyard with the bearing of a man who had never once doubted he was the most important person in any room. He went to his knee. Almost no sound. A man of that discipline makes nothing undignified happen, not even surrender. He went down cleanly, one knee meeting the stone without a creak or a stumble, and his hands rested on his raised knee, old hands, scarred along the knuckles with the strength still in them of a man who had not let age negotiate with his body on his behalf. They did not shake. He spoke the formula in full, every word of the traditional oath, in the old law's language, nothing abbreviated, nothing hurried. The voice of a man who understood that the words were a legal instrument and treated them accordingly. It was, by any standard of law in the Seven Kingdoms, unchallengeable. Jon watched him. He had expected something, he realized. Some specific feeling. Completion, perhaps, or the satisfaction of a thing concluded. He had ridden from Castle Black to this courtyard in the Westerlands, over several months of cold and march and battle and argument, and the realm was pacified now, and Tywin Lannister's voice was still producing the last syllables of his fealty oath below him. He felt, instead of victory, the weight of what came next. Jaime Lannister stood at the edge of the assembled men and watched his father kneel. He did not look at Jon. He looked at Tywin, at the old hands and the unshaking shoulders, and the voice that did not bend even when the knee did, with a face that was unreadable to everyone present. Cersei was not there. Tywin finished the oath. He rose without assistance. with the same deliberateness with which he had gone down. Jon met his eyes. Tywin Lannister looked at him with the green eyes that had never stopped calculating, that had been calculating since before the oath began, that were calculating now, and said nothing at all. He did not need to. The calculation had been completed. The courtyard held its quiet, and the afternoon light caught the gold in the rock above them, and somewhere out in the harbor the Baratheon fleet sat on the water and did not need to fire a single gun. And Jon Snow, who was Aegon Targaryen, who was 16 years old, felt the full weight of the Seven Kingdoms settle across his shoulders for the first time, and understood that it would not come off. The black cells were below the waterline. Jon went down alone, without guards, without ceremony, which was the only way to do it. The staircase descended through 3 levels of old stone, and the smell changed with each one, from the general cold damp of the keep's foundations to something older and more specific, the smell of a place that had been holding people for centuries and retained the fact of it in the walls. Torch brackets empty, doors of iron-banded oak, closed, the sound of water somewhere, distant, the black water running beneath the rock. The door at the end of the last corridor was open. A guard stood outside it and stepped aside when Jon came. Ned Stark was sitting against the far wall. He was thin. The bruising had gone yellow at the edges in the way that bruising does when it is healing, which meant it had been there long enough to begin healing, which meant they had started early. He was pale in the way of a man who had not seen full daylight in weeks, and there was a quality to his stillness that was different from the stillness Jon had known at Winterfell, the settled stillness of a man in his own hall. This was the stillness of someone who had learned to be very quiet in a small space, and had not yet unlearned it. He looked up when Jon came through the door. Jon crossed the cell, and Ned stood slowly, carefully, the movement of a body reminding itself how, and they gripped each other's forearms in the warrior's greeting, which was the greeting of men who did not embrace in front of others and had never needed to. They held it a moment longer than the greeting required. "You look like your mother," Ned said. Jon held his gaze. There was a great deal he could have said, had been carrying to say, had rehearsed in the abstract during the months of marching. "You could have told me. I tried to keep you safe. I know." A pause. The torch in the corridor moved in a draft, light shifting across the cell floor. "I'm not angry." Ned looked at him, reading him the way Ned had always read people, not the fast tactical read Stannis used, but the slower, more patient assessment of a man who believed that most things, given enough attention, would reveal themselves. "I'm going to be angry later," Jon said, "when there's time." Something moved in Ned's face. Not a smile, not quite, the near smile of a man recognizing a quality he did not expect to find where he found it. "That's very Stannis of you." "Don't tell him that," Jon said. Ned almost smiled. The great sept of Baelor was full. Every lord of consequence who could reach King's Landing in time had reached King's Landing in time, because the coronation of a new dynasty was not an event at which absence went unnoticed or uninterpreted. They packed the sept's vast interior in their house colors, the direwolf of the north, the trout of the Tullys, the stag of the Stormlands, the rose of the Reach, the sun and spear of Dorne, all of them present and facing forward and watching the high septon cross the marble floor toward the young man standing before the altar. The crown was iron, 7 points, 1 for each kingdom, each tipped in the metal that kingdom was known for, gold for the Westerlands, silver for the Vale, bronze for the Stormlands, copper for the Reach, steel for the North, black iron for the Iron Islands, white gold for Dorne, an argument made in metal, not one kingdom raised above the others, not the gold of Lannister supremacy or the pure iron of Baratheon conquest, but everything together, every part of the realm present in the thing that represented it. It was the most deliberate crown Jon had ever seen. He had thought about it for a month. He had worked with a smith at Robb's recommendation, described the intent, let the smith interpret the execution. The result was not beautiful in any traditional sense. It was correct. The high septon placed it on his head. Jon had known it would be heavy. He had held it before the ceremony, tested the weight, told himself he was prepared for it. He had not been prepared for it. Not the physical weight, that was what it was, iron and 7 metals, manageable. The other weight? The weight that arrived the moment the high septon's hands left it, and it was his alone to hold up. Every lord in the sept, every face turned toward him, every hope and fear and calculation in every pair of eyes, all of it landing simultaneously, a pressure that had no physical location and no physical solution. He stood under it. He did not let it show. After the sept, before the first formal business of the small council, Jon went to the throne room alone. The doors stood open. Ghost came with him and sat at the bottom of the dais steps and looked up at the thing made of swords. Jon looked at it, at the blades jutting from every surface, the 15 feet of irregular spikes, the iron that had gone dark with everything it had absorbed over 300 years of kings. He had stood in front of it once before on the morning the city fell and turned away from it deliberately, and that choice had been correct for that morning. This morning was different. He walked up the steps, turned, and sat. The armrests found him immediately, the edges precise and patient, exactly as advertised. He shifted his weight once, finding the one angle where the thing could be occupied without drawing blood. The iron was cold beneath him, cold in the way of metal that had been cold for centuries and intended to remain so. He settled into it, felt its weight against his back, the architectural hostility of it pressing into him at every point. He sat in it for several minutes, not performing anything, not making a statement for any audience, simply learning what it felt like, so that it could not be something he had never done when the moment came to occupy it properly. The room smelled of old stone and candle wax, and the ghost of blood beneath both. Then he stood, descended the steps, and went to meet his small council. Stannis Baratheon took the hand seat with the same absence of ceremony he brought to everything. He had moved his personal documents into the tower the previous evening, organized them by category and priority, and had 3 matters requiring immediate royal attention documented on parchment before Jon arrived. Ned Stark sat briefly as Master of Laws, long enough to review the legal instruments required to formalize the transfer of power. He was thin still, moving carefully, but his mind had not been touched by the cells. Within a week, he was producing legal analysis at the pace of a man who had been doing it for decades. Petyr Baelish was not at the table. He was not in the city. The chaos that had sustained his particular form of influence, the competing claims, the financial crisis, the absence of a legitimate central authority had not materialized in the way he had structured his plans around. He had vanished from court during the transition with the unobtrusive efficiency of a man who had made vanishing a professional skill. He was somewhere. That somewhere would require finding, eventually. Not today. Davos Seaworth sat at the far end of the table, in the clothes of a man who had not yet grown comfortable with being sat at such a table, which Jon had decided was exactly the right quality for master of ships. Jon had raised him to lordship by personal command the week the city fell. Davos had accepted it with the specific discomfort of a man who spent his life moving toward the right thing without expecting to be recognized for it. The lords were assembled. The realm had its government. Ned left on the 10th day. Jon walked with him to the stables. Just the 2 of them, which required navigating 3 separate attempts by attendants to accompany them. All politely declined. The morning was cool. The Red Keep's yard was quiet at that hour, the light still pale. "Go home," Jon said. "Winterfell is yours, the north is yours. I need a man I trust at the top of the world." Ned adjusted the saddle cinch with the unhurried competence of a man who had done this himself for 40 years, and saw no reason to stop. "You don't need me here, an advisor who knew you before? I have Stannis." Jon looked at him. "I have quite enough cold logic for one court." A pause. "I need warmth in the north, someone the northern lords will answer to and the small folk will trust, someone who understands that the realm runs on the things that don't appear in legal documents." He held Ned's gaze. "I need you there more than here." Ned looked at him for a long moment, the same patient assessment as always. "You've grown up," Ned said quietly. Not a compliment, exactly. An observation, the kind of observation that carries equal measures of pride and grief. "I had good teachers," Jon said. "Most of them." Ned mounted. He looked down at Jon from the saddle, at the iron crown, at the boy underneath it who was not a boy anymore, at Lyanna's face and Rhaegar's jaw and the gray eyes that were all Stark. He did not say goodbye. He rode out of the yard. Jon watched him go. The first snow fell on King's Landing 3 weeks into the new reign. Not the snow of a real northern winter. Nothing that would stay, nothing that would accumulate on the stones and change the city's character. A first flurry light and exploratory, the sky sending down a preliminary argument for what was coming. Flakes on the Red Keep's gardens, on the iron points of the crown on its stand, on the city below where the small folk were still working out what peace meant and whether this version of it was going to hold. Stannis found Jon at the window of the Hand's Tower. They stood and looked north together the way they had been standing and looking north, in various rooms since Castle Black. Below them, the city. Below the city, the problems. Baelish somewhere, building something out of sight. the Ironborn, who were never not a problem, the Reach too comfortable with its own wealth, and too recently submitted to be trusted with that comfort. Dorne still carrying Elia Martell in its chest like a wound that healed on the surface and did not heal beneath. The Faith Militants' ambitions, which had been quiet during the campaign and would not remain quiet. The merchants wanting certainty. The small folk wanting food. The endless, unglamorous work of a realm that was whole on paper and required constant effort to remain whole in practice. And beyond all of it, beyond Winterfell, beyond the wall's thin carved line, something in the dark, moving with the patience of something that had been moving since before the first men crossed the arm of Dorne. Vast, cold, waiting. "The game is finished," Stannis said. Jon looked at the snow falling on the city. "Is it?" Stannis turned from the window, the gray eyes, iron undertoned, holding the flat light of a northern morning. "The Game of Thrones. That game is finished. The throne has its king. The law is restored. The Lannisters are broken. House Baratheon will endure in the Stormlands." A pause. The jaw held exactly as it had held in every room, in every cold, since Dragonstone. "Every problem you were born to solve is solved." Jon said, "There's something else coming, Stannis." "I know. We're not ready. I know that too." The snow fell. The city breathed its ordinary morning breath. Smoke, animals, the early noise of a city that had survived and was already busy with the work of forgetting it had been in danger. Below the window, a child ran across the yard with a dog at its heels. "The game is finished," Stannis said again, quietly. The statement of a man completing a thought he had started months ago on a stone floor in Dragonstone, with a scroll in his hands and everything he had ever wanted already on its way to being lost. Now the real war begins. Jon reached to the stand beside him, touched the iron crown, just the tips of his fingers against the cold metal, the 7 points and the 7 metals and the weight of 7 kingdoms pressed into something a man could hold. He held it there for a moment, the cold of the iron against his fingertips, the snow against the window, ghost somewhere below, white against the gray stones of the yard. He let go, then he picked it up, then he put it on. In the south, they said winter was coming. In the north, they had always known what that meant. And high above the world, beyond the wall, beyond the endless cold, the dead rose and the long night gathered its armies. The true war had no Iron Throne. It had no legal documents and no great council precedents. It had only the cold and the dark and the men standing against them. One of those men wore a crown he never asked for. He would be sufficient. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.